This is my own essay called Through the Labyrinth of the Heart, a queer phenomenology of music and poetry in 19th-century German art song. This chapter presents a queer phenomenology of 19th-century German art song, particularly that of Schubert. Musicologists and others have written extensively about the connection between Schubert's sexual orientation and his music, whether his work generally or his lieder in particular. Note, the term Lied, German for song, usually refers in academic discourse to the Kunstlied, literally art song, so called to distinguish bourgeois song composition from the Volkslied, folk song. The latter category held its own position of importance as a romantic touchstone. These accounts have tended to focus either on the biography of Franz Schubert, or on the question of how queerness appears in his music. Note, the biographical inquiry that launched the debate over both the nature and the relevance of Schubert's sexuality was Maynard Solomon's Franz Schubert and the Peacocks of Benvenuto Cellini, Susan McClary's Constructions of Subjectivity in Schubert's Music, and Lawrence Kramer's Franz Schubert, Sexuality, Subjectivity, Song, all of which explore musicological implications of Schubert's possible queerness in both his songs and his instrumental music. V. Kofi Agawu's Schubert's Sexuality, A Prescription for Analysis, ? And Christopher Gibbs's The Life of Schubert offer open-minded and sensible responses to the problems of ascertaining both the truth and the scholarly significance of Schubert's homosexuality. End of note. My aim is something like the reverse. Not to say how art song is queer, but to say how queerness is like the art song. Key to my understanding is the temporal dimension of both the music-text relationship and the experience of non-binary gender, the form of queerness most pertinent to this analysis. The first part of this chapter develops the analogy between the aesthetic temporalities of art song and the phenomenological temporalities of queerness. The second part elaborates the dialectical structures at play in both, comparing, by way of example, Schubert's settings of Müller's Auf dem Flüsse and Goethe's An den Mond, both settings D 259 and D 296. In the temporality of German art song, poetry comes first. Unlike composers of opera, who are often in a position to make demands on a librettist, song composers did not write their own texts or indeed have any hand in the writing, with few exceptions. Note, while it was common for song composers to make alterations to their chosen texts, these were generally small and served musical rather than literary purposes. All this finds the lead composer in a role as much editorial and hermeneutical as musical. The composer as hermeneut became something like a close reader of poetry, in the sense in which the term is currently used in literary studies, with the additional alchemizing task of rendering their reading into musical form while retaining the text as something like a substrate. The process was not new. What changed for the German Romantics at the turn of the 19th century was the rekindled intensity of interest in the hermeneutical act itself. Note, this analogy holds for any composition avidly seeking the meaning of a self-enclosed, pre-existing text. This includes many art song traditions across time and language, and in many cases excludes opera, whose composers since Mozart have often had influence in the writing or preparation of libretti. I note as a postscriptum that I have unfortunately made it sound like Metastasian opera never happened. Back to note. For E.T.A. Hoffmann's brilliantly romantic account of the difference between a poet's and librettist's tasks, see The Poet and the Composer. My argument depends on a structural likeness between this art song temporality and the dynamic of queer experience, which for present purposes I define as a drive toward the recovery of lost potential in how we live and love. Analogous to this existential drive toward wholeness is the attraction of one artistic medium toward another. Music restores something of the expressive or affective potential that thought and feeling lose in becoming language. This is the essence of the analogy between the aesthetics of art song and the phenomenology of queerness. I hope to show the particular openness of this hybrid form to the experience of non-binary gender, taking the verbal and musical parts of song less as lovers than as necessary and inseparable aspects of the self. Metaphors, particularly comparisons with abstract qualities of space and time, are some of theorists' most reliable tools for discussing queerness. Some, including many classicists, have made the past a refuge of queer alterity. José Esteban Muñoz locates queerness expressly in a future as a horizon of yet unrealized social potential. In No Future, Lee Edelman calls queer that which resists the cultural imperative toward heterosexual reproduction. Sarah Ahmed adapts the vocabulary of phenomenology, not least of all its reliance on perceptual relationships with the objects and places in one's surroundings, to the goal of making queerness communicable. The spatial meaning of the word orientation is a major theme of Ahmed's queer phenomenology. Orientations, objects, others. Block quote. The work of inhabitants involves orientation devices, ways of extending bodies into spaces that create new folds or new contours of what we could call livable or inhabitable space. If orientation is about making the strange familiar through the extension of bodies into space, then disorientation occurs when that extension fails. We could say that some spaces extend certain bodies and simply do not leave room for others. Now, in living a queer life, the act of going home or going back to the place I was brought up has a certain disorienting effect. The, quote, family home seems so full of traces of heterosexual intimacy that it is hard to take up my place without feeling those traces as points of pressure. In such moments, when bodies do not where they have been given a place, such feelings in turn point to other places, even ones that have yet to be inhabited. My own story of orientation, still Ahmed's words, makes just such a queer point, end quote. Ahmed, like Muñoz and others, finds that queerness is elsewhere, not here, not now, not yet. This is why queer phenomena, queer relationships, unsanctioned sex acts, non-binary gender, which in their actual nature are perfectly well describable, are nevertheless proscribed at the level of language by denial of a clear and proper name. The suppression of the concept of non-binary gender is, I have found, directly related to others' fears about what happens to the norms for their own gender if people like me, and hence anyone, can simply opt out of these norms. The greatest fear of all seems to come from the realization that the sacrifices made in the name of maintaining a socially legible and laudable gender were never really necessary and are ultimately self-inflicted. Note: this is, of course, not to say that cisgender or heterosexual people cannot live authentically, only that they too will have to find brave and creative ways of doing so. Confer Eve Sedgwick's point about, quote, lesbians and gays who could never count as queer, and other people who vibrate to the chord of queer without having much same-sex eroticism. Thank you, Eve Sedgwick. End note. Queerness is the refusal to inauthentically disown possibilities conferred by birth. Note: I owe this helpful phrase, possibilities conferred by birth, to the dialectic of enlightenment, which also brilliantly answers the question of why and how that which remains possible is made to seem impossible. The possibilities conferred by birth, quote, are molded to fit the production of goods that can be bought on the market. Each human being has been endowed with a self of his or her own, different from all others, so that it could all the more surely be made the same. That's Adorno and Horkheimer. Often this requires a process of undisowning, of claiming or reclaiming what is rightly one's own. This is a never-ending process, a way of being in the world. Where Munoz and Edelman figure queerness as a matter of futurity, or lack thereof, and Ahmed as a phenomenon of spatial relationality, I understand queerness as a dialectical process of overcoming distance. Distances in space as well as time, and just as frequently, in socially mediated concepts. Note, by dialectics, I mean the basic analytical structure, quote, more of X means more of Y, but more of Y means less of X. It is not my aim to align myself with any one thinker's conception of, quote, the dialectic, unquote. I undertake more detailed dialectical analysis of the art song form elsewhere. This analysis takes the view that in its originary state, a thing is neither queer nor not queer. It just is what it is, with all its natural potential. Something becomes queer when its regulation becomes a non-necessary tool of social order. It's easy, for instance, to imagine a society that condemns violence as antisocial, and yet never happens upon the idea of treating any kind of desire as intrinsically violent against nature. If a culture develops a controlling attitude toward the very fact of sexual desires, then refusing to have one's desires corralled is a potentially queer stance, regardless of what those desires are. If, on the other hand, a culture has not developed such attitudes, then even outright homosexuality may not be all that queer in principle. Queerness is relative not as points on a spectrum are, but as orientations are, confer Ahmed's spatial and my temporal analyses. There's danger in speaking of originary states, lest hypothetical ones be confused with actual historical moments, or historical moments be imagined as utopias. The originary states with which I am most concerned are those that exist in lived reality, the possibilities conferred by birth, rather than hypothetical indices of primordial humanity, such as those in Rousseau's discourses on the origins of inequality and of language. Note, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Rousseau believed that although language and song have a common origin in the need to communicate emotion, over time the two become separated, a process that becomes accelerated as a result of the invention of writing. The latter, however, Rousseau's discourses, are not easily dispensed with as heuristics for the sense of lost potential that drives language toward the other art forms, or all art forms toward one possibility, particularly in the Romantic imagination. Their meaning is not what theoretically once was, but what actually could be. Rousseau's natural man, quote-unquote, existed prior to the separation of queer and not queer. He, or better they, also existed before the separation of music and language. This Rousseauian speech song is hypothetical, but has real historical progeny in the sung poetry of the ancient Greek world. In A Poet's Glossary, Edward Hirsch writes, "Song was originally inseparable from poetry. They were one and the same, and poems were meant to be chanted and sung, sustained by oral tradition. Poetry is still considered song in many parts of the world," end quote. Ancient Greek poetry, epic as well as lyric, was always sung to musical accompaniment, with melos being the term used for the lyric text, meaning poems meant for singing. Edward Hirsch continues, they were performative, ancient lyrics. The musical element is so intrinsic to poetry that one never forgets its origins in musical expression, in singing, chanting, and recitation to musical accompaniment. How did modern lyrics lose their once indispensable musical element? Hirsch explains, quote, block quote, before the 18th century, writers or critics seemed to make little or no distinction between melodic lyrics such as Thomas Campion's airs or the songs of William Shakespeare's plays, and non-musical written lyrics such as Shakespeare's sonnets. During the Renaissance, English writers first began to write their lyrics for readers rather than composing them for musical performance. The word song increasingly came to suggest a literary composition in verse form. Songs were still written for music, but the term song was also used metaphorically, as in Christopher Smart's A Song to David, or William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, which are meant to be read. End quote. The present analysis takes special interest in the idea of song as a metaphorical way to suggest the latent musical potential of a poem, as well as the fact that by Shakespeare's time, even the, quote, little song or sonnet was no longer song at all, unless, that is, a composer chose to make it such, to compose a tune for it. What is the meaning of the metaphor that calls a poem a song? The following entry from the diaries of Wilhelm Müller sheds some light. In German, ich kann weder spielen noch singen, und wenn ich dichte, so singe ich doch und spiele auch. Wenn ich die Weisen von mir geben könnte, so würden meine Lieder besser gefallen als jetzt. Aber getrost, es kann sich ja eine gleichgesinnte Seele finden, die die Weise aus den Worten heraushorcht und sie mir zurückgibt. I can neither play nor sing, yet when I write verses, I sing after all and play as well. If I could produce the melodies, my songs would please better than they do now. But courage. Perhaps a kindred spirit will be found, who will hear the tunes behind the words and give them back to me. Translation's mine, except where noted. Müller's words assume their full meaning in light of music history. For the 45 poems immortalized in Schubert's two major song cycles, Die Schöne Müllerin and Winterreise, achieved a life in posterity beyond anything else Müller would ever write or do. There's a prophetic realism in the thought that a gleichgesinnte Seele, literally a same-sensed soul, could draw out, or rather hear out, heraushorchen, something of the word's unrealized potential, and restore it to wholeness through the addition of music. Such a musical complement, which must spring from the generous and generative activity of another's sympathetic interpretation, hearing out the words, the tunes from the words, is in the same measure an act of giving the words back to their author, zurückgeben. Without the sympathy of this musical complement, the words are in some sense lost to their author, who accordingly wishes for the intervention of a kindred spirit, gleichgesinnte Seele, who might musically restore those lost words to their author in their originally conceived power to please, gefallen. It is this sense of loss, not the natural an irremediable removal that death brings, but rather the merely contingent and non-necessary shutting off of possibilities that remain throughout life. That grounds the analogy between queer experience and the hybrid form of the art song. The matter of priorness, priority in time, and the generative instability of that priority is central to the analogy. The lack Müller finds in his verses is experienced as a sequence of impressions in time. I can neither sing nor play, yet when I write verses, I sing after all and play as well. Some original inadequacy in the author, real or imagined, may be partly overcome by effort or inspiration, but the sense remains that more could be done to bring the utterance to its expressive potential. Potential neither actualized nor lost in the writing. Dichten. Dichten now means specifically to write poetry. Following the writing, there exists a now, jetzt, in which the poems, called songs, Lieder, exist in default of the wanted musical element, which seems to hide somewhere within the words. Following this now comes the thought of a possible future in which another artistic agent might make good on this latent potential, eliciting the music by sympathetic hearing, heraushorchen. The giving back, zurückgeben, of the poem to the poet is a happy paradox, the restoration of something never lost yet previously not had. In Eros the Bittersweet, Anne Carson writes, "When I desire you, part of me is gone. My want of you partakes of me." So reasons the lover at the edge of Eros. The presence of want awakens in him the nostalgia for wholeness. The logic, including the implied sequentiality of nostalgia for a unity out of memory, bears a structural similarity to the experience of lack expressed in however different a context by Müller. Though supra-historical in import, Carson's genealogy of erotic discourse takes the same starting point as Edward Hirsch's history of the term song. The originary moment of the lyric itself in ancient Greece, particularly the monodies of Sappho. The erotic and the lyric concepts of the Western tradition are as inseparable in their origin as are words and music themselves. I do not wish to overstate the metaphor of erotic desire for the apparent pull between the disparate artistic media. In Carson's reading of Sappho, the self breaks apart long before the two elements of song do. Nor on the view of queerness presented above is there anything specifically queer in the Sapphic speaker's accounts of desire, which, as Carson observes, cleave firmly to the phenomenological and stand largely apart from matters of social expectation, nor yet in the fact of artistic media finding their way back to one another as if by will. I wish, too, to stop short of anthropomorphizing these media beyond the purview of metaphor. Fortunately for my argument, others have taken such interpretive risks. In The Queen's Throat, Wayne Kestenbaum writes, "I hypothesize that opera's hypnotic hold over modern gay audiences has some connection to the erotic interlocking of words and music, two contrary symbolic systems with gendered attributes. I am an opera fan because I crave the soprano voice. But I could also trace my queer fandom to the nature of opera, which places words and music together and apart, always both at once. Opera's task is to recombine words and music, the severed halves of a body once single and whole. We no longer believe in coherence. The idea of a unified body seems tyrannical, oppressive. We prefer to think that flesh is symbolically fragmented. And yet, I, living in opera's shadow, sometimes experience a desire for wholeness and a simultaneous desire for fragmentation, a contrary back and forth movement." End quote. White cisgender gay men are by far the most visible queer demographic in Western classical music. Yet Kostenbaum's remark on queer sexuality and opera apply equally well to the analogy between queerness of gender and art song. Between the time of Sapphic monody and the development of opera, words and music had split. Members of the Florentine Camerata, generally recognized as the inventors of opera, worked assiduously to recombine words and music in hopes of reconstructing the lost musico-poetic speech of the ancient Greeks. Note, see Peter Kivy, Osmond's Rage, Philosophical Reflections on Opera. At many junctures in history, cultural conditions have produced an enthusiasm for the artistic pursuit of the lost whole, often in dialectical lockstep with forces driving the media apart, such as the rise of absolute music as a concept. Note, see John Neubauer, or Neubauer, The Emancipation of Music from Language, Departure from Mimesis in 18th Century Aesthetics. The era of English lute song, as mentioned by Hirsch, was just such a moment. The beginnings of Romanticism in the German-speaking lands were another. The wish to restore lost wholeness seems to permeate both theoretical and artistic endeavors of the period. There's a sense that better is possible, that much good has been needlessly cut off. This instinct is not a utopian vision, but a firm knowledge of possible realities. This knowledge, whether fully conscious or not, is central to my understanding of both the phenomenon of queerness and Schubert's art. This sense of unrealized potential is clear in the case of Müller, both because his letters and diary, as seen above, encapsulate the feeling so memorably, and because for many readers the verses themselves bear out the impression that they could do more, particularly in comparison with a poet like Goethe, whose verse tends towards more detailed sonic patterning and more ambitious argumentation. Quote, for a detailed account of Müller's reputation in both his own day and posterity, see Susan Ewen's Schubert Müller and Die Schöne Müllerin. Yet even Goethe, as Joe Tudor notes, believed that music can potentially sensualize a great deal more sense about the universe than language can, end quote. Goethe was in the first place, quote, a writer acutely aware of both the splendors and miseries of language, end quote, and in spite of his, quote, anthropocentric and language-centric view of the world, well aware that there is more to the universe on all sides than man and his media can encompass. In this perspective, Tudor continues, his comments on sound phenomena appear an appraisal of their faculty for conveying ideas on the very edge of thought, experience, and language, end quote. Thus, the remainder of this chapter compares Schubert's handling of poems by both Müller and Goethe, each addressing a river. Auf dem Flusse, on the river, from Winterreise, D 911/7, and An den Mond, to the moon, settings D 259 and D 296, highlighting the dialectical workings, which I read as queer, of the word-text relationship both within each setting and generically. This is followed by a final consideration of the analogy between the dialectics of overcoming in art song aesthetics and in queer phenomenology. Here is Müller's poem in its entirety. Auf dem Flusse, der du so lustig rauchtest, du heller wilder Fluss, wie still bist du geworden, gibst keinen Scheidegruß. Mit harter, starrer Rinde hast du dich überdeckt, liegst kalt und unbeweglich, im Sande ausgestreckt. In deine Decke grab ich mit einem spitzen Stein den Namen meiner Liebsten, Stund und Tag hinein. Den Tag des ersten Grüßes, den Tag, an dem ich ging. Namen und Zahlen windet sich ein zerbrochener Ring. Mein Herz, in diesem Bache erkennst du nun dein Bild, obst unter seiner Rinde wohl auch so reisend schwelt. On the river. You who rippled so merrily, clear, boisterous river, how still you have become. You give no parting greeting. With a hard, rigid crust you have covered yourself. You lie cold and motionless, stretched out in the sand. On your surface I carve, with a sharp stone, the name of my beloved, the hour and the day of our first greeting, the date I departed. A round name and figures, a broken ring is entwined. My heart, do you now recognize your image in this brook? Is there not beneath its crust, likewise a seething torrent? Translated by Richard Wigmore. A distinction well known within but rarely mentioned outside of music departments is that between the strophic song, in which each stanza of a poem with regular form is set to the same music, and through composed, durchkomponierte song, in which the composer provides different music for each part of the poem. The rise of through composed Lieder from the late 18th century into the 19th centuries was a defining feature of the romantic reinvention of art song. Yet the strophic form persisted alongside the through composed song even up to the turn of the 20th century. The early Romantics were in no way the first to combine strophic and through composed settings into the so-called modified strophic form, with alternating sections repeating and non-repeating music. They did, however, deploy it with renewed inventiveness and sensitivity. This, in turn, dialectically, brought renewed meaning to the choice of strophic and through composed forms. One need never be chosen over the other by default, where the two can coexist. Auf dem Flusse is a good example of a through composed Schubertian Lied. The first two stanzas are set to the same music, the second two to comparable but increasingly unlike music, while the final stanza expanded into so many repetitions as to take up nearly half of the music, does something entirely its own. Mein Herz, in diesem Bache erkennst du nun dein Bild. My heart, in this brook, do you now see your own image? Repeats querulously, passionately, meditatively, almost violently. Ob's unter seiner Rinde wohl auch so reisend schwelt. Under its, the river's crust, does it, the heart's image, likewise swell so ragingly? Read or spoken, the rhetorical question yields an image, a live current of feeling, undiminished by the overgrowth of a static, icy exterior, like a river frozen over, compelling enough to linger over, but unlikely to persist in memory. The words. The return of the opening melody in the piano brings a sense of recuperation, even as the voice finishes in a far more agitated state of conversation with the heart than the measured contemplation of its opening address to the frozen river. The intervening stanzas recounting the speaker's inscription in the ice each begin with a hopeful major-toned interlude that quickly slides into and out of melancholic minor mode modulations, so that by the end of the song, the quickly changing tonal and emotional registers leave the listener with the impression of having made a journey, a kind of interior detour within the larger journey of Winterreise. In order to give sensory immediacy to Miller's words, Schubert intervenes aggressively in their structure, adding extensive repetition and variation for the sake of dramatizing the range of emotions contained in them. In contrast, his approach to Goethe's more textually replete An den Mond requires a more delicate touch. Here's Goethe's poem, An den Mond. Fühlest wieder Busch und Tal, still mit Nebelglanz. lösest endlich auch einmal meine Seele ganz, breitest über mein Gefied, lindernd deinen Blick, wie des Freundes Auge mild über mein Geschick. Jeden Nachklang fühlt mein Herz, froh und trübe und Zeit, wandle zwischen Freude und Schmerz in der Einsamkeit. Fließe, fließe, lieber Fluss, nimmer werd ich froh, so verrauscht der Scherz und Kuss und die Treue so. Ich besaß es doch einmal, was so köstlich ist, dass man doch zu seiner Qual nimmer es vergisst. Rausche Fluss das Tal entlang, ohne Rast und Ruhe. Rausche, flüstre meinem Sang Melodien zu, wenn du in der Winternacht wütend überschwehst oder die Frühlingspracht junger Knospen quist. Selig, wer sich vor der Welt ohne Hass verschließt, einen Freund am Busen hält und mit dem genießt, was von Menschen nicht gewusst oder nicht bedacht, durch das Labyrinth der Brust wandelt in der Nacht. To the moon. You fill bush and valley once again, softly with misty gleam. You free once more at last, my soul entire. You spread over my land your softening gaze, like a friend's gentle eye upon my fate. My heart feels every echo of glad and troubled times. I wander between joy and pain in solitude. Flow, dear river, flow, never shall I be glad. Just so rushed laughter and kisses away, and faithfulness just so. For indeed I once possessed that which is so precious, that, however, to our torment, one forgets it never. River, rush along the valley, without pause or peace. Rush and whisper melodies for my song, when in the winter night you raging overflow, or in springtime splendor water the young buds. Blessed is he who, without hate, withdraws himself from the world, holds to his bosom one friend, and with him enjoys what's unknown to man, or never thought, through the labyrinth of the heart, wanders in the night. As he did in a number of instances, Schubert set this poem to music more than once. Of the earlier 1815 strophic setting, D259, pianist and scholar Graham Johnson writes, "The undulating little tune, and it need not be jaunty, has a simplicity and inevitability that can either be heard as perfection or dullness, depending on the tuning and sympathy of the ear. Once learnt, it haunts the listener like a gleam of moonlight in a corner of the unconscious." End quote. The success of Schubert's subsequent modified strophic treatment of the same text, D296, over and above that of its already considerable strophic predecessor, D259, shows not so much a linear advancement in conception as a dialectical sublimation of the strengths of the earlier composition into a form not necessarily better, but itself more dialectical, more in keeping with the poem's structure, and as such, perhaps better able to extend both the power and the precision of the word's expressive reach. In this setting, the second setting, pairs of stanzas are set strophically, with odd stanzas set to what I'll call melody A and even stanzas set to melody B. In the middle of the sixth stanza, the B melody begins as usual, but suddenly modulates on the words Rausche Fluss, rush river, into a dramatic through composed section as the river alternately rages and whispers. By introducing the modifications to the musical strophe in the middle of a B verse, Schubert upsets the two stanza groupings that have organized the whole song, just as the river becomes more dynamic and ultimately bursts its bounds. The piano also changes in this section. It leaves off its accustomed doubling of the vocal melody, taking on an independent arpeggio pattern at Rausche flüstre meinem Sang, rush, whisper to my song, and rejoining the voice climactically for the final two stanzas. In conclusion, the poem retreats from the external scene of the river into an intimate meditation on happiness, a benediction in scriptural tones. One overarching interpretive problem is the poem's title, To the Moon, in spite of which the moon fades quickly from view, with the poem's most frequent dramatic and explicit addresses directed instead to the river. In the end, it is the word wandeln and little more that solves this problem and offers a kind of formal closure, linking the speaker's riverside wandering, wandle zwischen Freude und Schmerz, I wander between joy and pain, to whatever it is that through the labyrinth of the heart wanders in the night, durch das Labyrinth der Brust wandelt in der Nacht, as the moon wanders in the nighttime sky, wandering in the night. The image of the moon binds together alike the speaker's inner and outer worlds and their past and present consciousness, the vacillations among which make up the emotional argument of the poem. Schubert's gifts as a reader-songwriter, a composer hermeneut, allow him to nimbly honor those poetic subtleties. The music simply keeps up, respectful yet undaunted, never competing, even with a poem of such density and richness. With Selig wer sich vor der Welt ohne Hass verschließt, to und mit dem genießt, blessed is the one who from the world draws away without hate. The opening melody returns, bringing with it a disarming softness after the noisy middle interlude. This hush and the return of the familiar melody lends the benediction in the text a haunting glow. The piano furthers this effect, doubling the voice as before, only this time it does so twice, at its accustomed register, and concurrently a shimmering octave higher. The recapitulation of the A melody thus brings a sense of homecoming coupled with ghostly new layers of musical suggestion. The listener might imagine newly opened spaces of undisturbed apartness, at once celestially above, so starlike is the effect of the doubled octave, and psychically within the individual perceiver. The final strophe goes one dialectical step further, bringing together melodies A and B and transforming them into a unified conclusion. The voice register drops dramatically into the labyrinth on Was von Menschen, what to men, singing a simple new variation in the bass regions. Over the voice, familiar as if by miracle, the piano now plays the melody once sung by the singer in the B stanzas. Breitest über mein Gefeld, you spread over my fields, picking up where the voice left off in the previous stanza. Einen Freund am Busen hält und mit dem genießt, holds one friend to his breast and with him enjoys. Note: Johnson, describing Auf dem Flusse, could just as easily have been discussing An den Mond. The traveler moves inward. The music mirrors this, and the shape of the vocal line at the beginning of the song is now heard in the piano. This accompanies a new vocal line, which is a rhetorically powerful parlando, set against a background of familiar melody and operative practice that prefigures a composer like Verdi. End note. At last, Wandelt in der Nacht is sounded low by the voice, then, once more, an octave higher. This doubling across registers encapsulates the poem's bringing together of river and moon, inner and outer, self and nature, sorrow and joy. It is the concluding gesture of the meticulously prepared musical synthesis of the last strophe, which merges both the lines of the piano and voice in the two contrasting melodies, A and B. The simultaneous impressions of deepening and transcendence that attend the closing stanzas make good on both the poem's particular resources and the facility of the modified strophic structure for both recuperation and development. Schubertian song composition is the art of unfolding a text's potential meanings in music. Some texts, such as Müller's, benefit considerably from active or even aggressive unfolding. Note: to be sure, some of Müller's poems, such as Der Lindenbaum, have greater independent power of suggestion. Am Brunnen vor dem Tore has accordingly a notoriety of its own. Other poems, including major works of Goethe, such as An den Mond, have so little need of addition that it is remarkable music finds something of value to add. Thus, in a doubly dialectical fashion, music can both help poetry say its unsayables and not quite unsayables, and somehow do the same where no such help is needed. This is another way of saying that music helps overcome the separation of inner and outer potential for expression. Music renders some, never all, of poetry's inwardness accessible to the outside, and likewise helps words penetrate inward. Note: it is worth noting that the above reading, which I have professed to be a queer one, operates at the level of form, over and above the clear suggestions of intimacy between him, Wer, who holds one friend, grammatically male, to his breast, and with him enjoys that which is unknown or unthought to men, wanders in the night in the labyrinth of the heart. It has been a secondary contention of this essay that the formal analysis mediated at the level of reception, as it always is, should be seen as included among, not opposed to, the methods of those who read with social purposes in mind. I'm going to say that again. Formal analysis mediated at the level of reception, as it always is, should be seen as included among, not opposed to, the methods of those who read with social purpose in mind. End note. Phenomenologically speaking, queerness is like the art song. Both are dialectically structured, temporally bound phenomena. Something happens to elicit the feeling that the self, the seeming monad, has cut off some part of itself. If the part of the self is missing, is the self still the self? If part of the self is missing, is the self still the self? If part was always missing, was anything ever itself? Something like this question is at work in the metaphor by which an unmusicalized poem is called a song. The metaphor suggests a potential whose past is unrecoverable. Did primordial man really sing their speech? Sappho did sing her poems, but to what tunes? Was there really life before compulsory cis-heterosexuality? Can there be a life outside it now? Potential whose past is unrecoverable, but whose very real implications are felt in the present. This chapter has taken the metaphor of poem as song as itself a metaphor for seeking what is always already at hand to be enjoyed. This, on the present view, is the central attitude of queerness, Even the most replete and self-sufficient thing, a Goethe poem, a person of deep character, can be caught off guard by the emerging realization that forms of goodness besides the universally unattainable are grievously absent or sorely missing. This feeling is embedded deeply in the aesthetic sensibility that reconceived the art song. Tudor writes, precisely because Goethe and others writing in his epic habitually understood music in terms of something else, and not infrequently understood other things in terms of music, we can finally see why, for Goethe and for some others, music is potentially connected with most things in the universe, and most things in the universe are potentially connected with music. End quote. The inseparability of music, or at least musical discourse, from metaphor, leaves its boundaries open-ended so that it cannot help but exist in relation to other media. The prominent lead baritone Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau offers a similar encapsulation of the aesthetic culture that birthed the Romantic art song. Dass in diesem Zeitraum der Wende vom 18. zum 19. Jahrhundert Poesie und Musik inniger als je zueinander strebten. Vielleicht liegt hier das Grundmotiv des Bedürfnisses, aus dem heraus Musik nach Gesang und folglich nach Dichtung verlangte. Das Bedürfnis nach höheren Sinn. That in this time span, the turn from the 18th to the 19th century, poetry and music strove more fervently than ever toward one another. Perhaps there lies here the fundamental motive for the need out of which music longed after song, and by implication after poetry, the need for higher meaning. With its emphasis on affective and relational dynamics, innig, zueinander streben, verlangen, inner, striving toward one another, longing. Fischer-Dieskau's language dramatizes the impulse that I have likened to the search for kinds of goodness foreclosed without necessity, which in turn I have likened to the experience of queer selfhood in both its aspiring and its unfolding. Doubling down on Bedürfnis, need, Fischer-Dieskau insists that the mutual attraction between music and text reflects some deep human need for höheren Sinn, higher meaning or sense, Sinn. The need, that is, to make sense of our own fragmented consciousness through connection with our gleichgesinnte Seelen, our kindred spirits, our same-sensed souls. Note: each translation of gleichgesinnte Seelen, kindred spirit, or same-sensed souls, the one more idiomatic and the other literal, makes the statement differently, the first emphasizing the social and the latter the aesthetic dimension of the composer's saving intervention in the poet's art. In Panesthetics, on the unity and diversity of the arts, Daniel Albright offers an eminently dialectical elaboration of this mutual together striving of unlike media in the following pair of reflections on the pitfalls and rewards of art's attempts to transgress the boundary between media. Every medium is the wrong medium, and every medium is the right medium. On the one hand, whatever integrity or consonance or radiance an artwork may possess in its home medium, Albright's words, tends to vanish with the rough intermedial handling that the artwork must undergo in the process of interpretation. Close quote. On the other hand, open quote, every medium is intimate with every other, because the senses themselves are only weakly segregated. It is improper to speak of rough handling in the translation of an artwork to an alien medium, because there are no alien media. Each artwork is already present in the mind as a painting, a poem, a piece of music. no matter what the medium of its original presentation. Indeed, there is something peculiarly seductive, warmly human, in the sidestep across media boundaries. End quote. The logic of being queer, of living and loving, could hardly find a more generative metaphor than in Albright's mutually desiring dialectic of the artistic media. The, quote, warmly human in the sidestep across media boundaries. The transformation, the actualization of the self is never complete and never has to be. Like a poem extended yet unexhausted by the addition of music, the unfolding of the self is the stuff of life itself. Neither queer nor not queer in conception, but needfully queer in practice if one is to thrive under conditions of constraint. In such a world, each extension, each sidestep, each song is a goodness in itself.